This lesson will cover Chapter 8, Key Issue 4. We'll be talking about different organizations that exist between countries to maintain stability, both politically and economically. And we will also discuss how some of those alliances and organizations have helped prevent conflicts from arising as well as potentially instigate them. Lastly, we will talk about the concept of terrorism and some events that are commonly believed to be categorized as terrorism, but we will also discuss why it is very difficult to understand what terrorism truly is. It is important to recognize that states compete for many reasons, including control of territory, access to trade and resources, and influence over one another. In order for states to achieve advantages, they often form alliances. The most important global organization is the United Nations. You know quite a bit about the UN already, but just to recap, it was created at the end of World War II by the Allies in the attempt to prevent another world war. The UN has grown dramatically with 51 original members and today 193. Ironically, although the United Nations served to maintain peace, it also began around the same time that tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union became high. After World War II, the Cold War broke out between the United States and the Soviet Union. Although this war was not physical, it certainly was symbolic and spoke to the heightened competition between the two states. The United States and the Soviet Union competed in many different areas, including economics, space exploration, nuclear advancements, and of course, spreading their governments across the world. The United States promoted democracy, where the Soviet Union promoted communism. The United Nations is said to have provided an important forum for the United States and Soviet Union to negotiate during the Cold War, so it could be said that the United Nations helped to ensure that the Cold War never broke out into a violent war. Returning to United Nations membership, take a look at Figure 8-51 located on page 294 of your textbook. You can see how dramatically countries start entering this organization and how much its membership increases. Figure 8-53 located on page 295 of your textbook will showcase aerial photographs that show the Soviet buildup in Cuba. These photographs signify the height of tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. What you see photographed here are 3 Soviet ships with missile equipment being unloaded at Mariel Naval Port in Cuba. You can also see missile transporters and fuel trailers. The Cuban Missile Crisis served as a major confrontation during the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union. It happened in 1962 when the Soviet Union secretly began to construct missile launching sites in Cuba. With this evidence that was collected by a collaborated effort with the United States and the United Nations, this led to the Soviet Union ending the crisis by dismantling them. It is said that without an organization like the United Nations at this time, this would have been a prime example for what would have instigated full-out war. After World War II, most European states joined one of 2 military alliances. On one side, you had the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, also known as NATO. This organization included the United States and Canada, as well as other European countries. In total, the original membership included 16 democratic states. On the other side, you had the Warsaw Pact. This was a military agreement among communist Eastern European countries. It's important to note today that NATO still exists and the Warsaw Pact was dismantled. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the pact went with it. NATO and the Warsaw Pact were designed to maintain balance of power in Europe. For NATO allies, the objective was to prevent the Soviet Union from overrunning West Germany with other smaller countries. The Warsaw Pact provided the Soviet Union with a buffer zone of allied states between it and Germany to discourage a third German invasion of the Soviet Union in the 20th century. When the Warsaw Pact disbanded, many of its former republics and members in it ended up joining NATO. NATO today comprises 29 states that make up its membership. In addition to military alliances, there were also two economic alliances that emerged during the Cold War. The first is the European Union, and this European Union formed in 1958 with 6 original members. The EU was designed to mend scars from World War II, which ended about 13 years prior. The Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, or COMECON, was the second one, and this formed in 1949 with 6 original members in 1960. This included Mongolia, Cuba, and Vietnam, and it was designed to promote trade and sharing of natural resources in communist Eastern Europe. Like the Warsaw Pact, this one disbanded, but the EU still exists. Both NATO and the EU have expanded tremendously since the Cold War. You should be familiar with a few other alliances in different regions of the world, to include the African Union, or the AU. This organization was established in 2002. It encompasses about 54 countries on the African continent, and it also replaced an earlier organization called the Organization of African Unity, founded in 1963, primarily to seek an end to colonialism and apartheid in Africa. The new organization has placed more emphasis on promoting economic integration of Africa. Another alliance or organization is the Commonwealth, and the Commonwealth includes the United Kingdom and 52 other states that were once British colonies, including Australia, Bangladesh, Canada, India, Nigeria, and Pakistan. Most other members are African states or island countries in the Caribbean or Pacific. The Commonwealth members seek economic and cultural cooperation. Let's spend some time looking at a few maps from your textbook. This is figure 8-54. It's located on page 296 of your textbook. As you can see, NATO and the Warsaw Pact represented the balance of power between the United States and the Soviet Union. You see NATO in green and the Warsaw Pact in orange. As a reminder, NATO has expanded while the Warsaw Pact ended. So looking at NATO, we can see that today it's got more than 24 member states, and you can see the original members and some of the later members, to include some former Soviet Union republics. Figure 8-56, located on page 297, shows that the European Union has also expanded and now includes former Soviet republics. And just as the Warsaw Pact disbanded, so did the Comecon, and now you see the persisting organizations include the Military Alliance of NATO and the Economic Alliance of the European Union. I will briefly address the concept of terrorism in this video, but go in more detail with it later because I want to dispel some of the misconceptions that the textbook goes into. Terrorism, as it is defined in your textbook, is the systematic use of violence by a group calculated to create an atmosphere of fear and alarm among a population, or to coerce a government into actions it would not otherwise undertake, or refrain from actions it wants to take. Distinctive characteristics of terrorists include: 1. Trying to achieve their objectives through organized acts that spread fear and anxiety among a population, such as bombing, kidnapping, hijacking, taking of hostages, and assassination. Second, viewing violence as a means of bringing widespread publicity to goals and grievances that are not being addressed through peaceful means. And lastly, believing in a cause so strongly that they do not hesitate to attack despite knowing that they will probably die in the act. Now, based in those general definitions or descriptions, one would say terrorism is actually quite broad and could also include or be applied to many different actions that are committed across the world. As you see in Figure 8-57, located on page 298 of your textbook, the number of terrorist attacks has increased in the last decade, especially in countries like Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Nigeria, and Syria. It is important to note that because the media has placed a lot of attention on events throughout the Middle East or attacks committed by Muslims, that this has created and generated these stereotypes that terrorism is directly associated with the religion of Islam. Many politicians in the United States have brought attention to events that have been committed, crimes that have been committed that have been labeled hate crimes as opposed to terrorist attacks. And many argue that the reluctancy to address these hate crimes as terrorist attacks means less aggressive action, as well as a continued stereotyping of what terrorism is. Keeping that in mind, and something we'll expand on later, it still is important for us to recognize that the world does categorize 3 of what it considers the most active terrorist organizations in the world. These organizations include Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and Boko Haram. We will spend some time learning a little bit about these organizations together as a class. This is the end of the lesson on Key Issue 4 and the end of Chapter 8.